Hello, good afternoon to those who are joining from Europe, and a good morning, good evening to those who are joining us from around the globe. It is good to see some familiar faces and names, but for those who do not know me, my name is Shana Gavron. I am the CEO of Endangered Wildlife, and I would like to welcome you to our latest webinar, Financially Valuing, Reporting, and Investing in Biodiversity. Besides myself, I have the pleasure of introducing my co-speaker, Stephanie Brendel, who is a highly respected shark advocate, passionate about her sharks, and will certainly bring diverse perspectives to the table, which I'm sure will lead to highly interesting Q&A session between us at the end of the presentations. In that regard, before we start, I would like to draw your attention to the questions tab. Please feel free to pop any questions you might have, and we will endeavor to address as many of those as possible in the time that we have left at the end of the webinar. A final piece of housekeeping: the webinar is being recorded and can be viewed via your registration link for up to 6 months from today. So, as I said, I am the CEO of Endangered Wildlife. Very briefly, who is EW? We are a specialist ESG software and consulting company that works with the financial value of valuation of biodiversity. Now, we've already achieved this a significant amount of credibility through the valuation of over 130 species, and by the acquisition of some high-named clients already. And also through a lot of meetings, we've encountered several conversations saying it's not possible to do valuations, but actually we've proven it is possible. And the reason why we are able to achieve this, in our opinion, is that possibly due to my own background, both from the finance and the conservation world, being able to somewhat join the parallel lines of biodiversity and finance to find a middle ground language that everyone is able to understand. So one of the big questions, though, which we want to address today is, why is this important? Why is this important from an investment perspective? Well, as we know, biodiversity is moving up in terms of the finance and business agenda. But the question sits, and there's a lot of ambiguity around this, is how do we report on biodiversity? How do we account for biodiversity? And how do we actually integrate biodiversity in a very understandable and tangible way that people can actually relate to and understand and transmit in their messaging? And the other issue comes in from the investment perspective is, how can performance actually be tracked and managed in a way that you'd be managing and tracking standard investments? Now, biodiversity itself effectively is our responsibility, and it's the responsibility of investors, corporates, the financial institutions, and not only the government. But before we actually can consider what biodiversity is as an investment, let's just think about what is biodiversity and what is it not. Now, a very simple definition, effectively, is that biodiversity is the diversity, this is key, living organisms, whether that's plants, animals, fungi, or even microorganisms. So if that's what biodiversity is, what is it not? It is not a single metric. There are many biodiversity indices out there, but these are difficult to interpret and understand and apply without specialist knowledge. It is not carbon. Carbon is effectively just a chemical element, and CO2 is one of the greenhouse gases that is emitted when fossil fuels are burnt. It is not a living organism. It is the backbone of organic molecules. And when we look at natural capital, biodiversity is part of natural capital. Natural capital is essentially the stock of all natural reserves, whether that's geology, soil, water, spatial ecosystem areas, or biodiversity. But natural capital is somewhat of a macro perspective. Biodiversity can then be seen as effectively a micro perspective. Now, investors have the ability to ethically direct financial flows to biodiversity, either directly or indirectly. But again, there's that argument, how do we analyze or how do we evaluate, and how do we measure our own performances relative to the performance of biodiversity? Now, when we start looking at the options that are available, just as a starter, there are more and more options coming available, but there's still limited solutions for investors to invest and direct their money to biodiversity. Traditionally, you have got things like negative screening. The problem with negative screening is what companies are actually reporting on biodiversity at the moment. Very few companies are. I know there's recently on LinkedIn the discussion about just a handful that can actually be identified as having no negative impact on biodiversity. But even so, companies are not yet at that point of fully disclosing what their impact is on biodiversity. And it just comes down again to the problem of how do you report on biodiversity? Second one are bond investments or bond instruments. These have been around for much longer. But you could argue again, how do you link that to the performance of the survival of the species? Some of the newer devices, reforestation investments, the question then is, what happens with the wildfire? What happens with how the forests are being reforested? Are they native species? Are they invasive species? Are these being taken into consideration and looked at when you're actually doing an investment? Another new topic is the blue carbon, considering the fact that your seagrass, your sea kelp, all of these, I know that there's more talk about the whales. Every species effectively in the ocean could be a carbon sink. Then we have the idea of tokenization. Now, tokenization, again, comes down to how do you put a value on the underlying species that you're trying to tokenize. Without being able to fully account for that value, isn't it just a random number? How do you assess the performance of a token if you cannot actually understand that underlying value? Similarly, when you talk about biodiversity credits, biodiversity credits cannot operate in the same way as a carbon credit. Going back to what biodiversity is and what it is not, biodiversity cannot be directly compared to carbon. Carbon is not a living organism, biodiversity is. So biodiversity credits are a solution, but not necessarily the full solution for actually investing in biodiversity. Then comes the option of what else is there? There are alternative ways of actually investing directly into biodiversity. And essentially, this is what we're starting to work on, and looking at how do you actually invest directly into a species and have a vested interest in its survival, in its long-term growth, and actually make biodiversity a direct investable financial instrument. This would allow you to assess and value your value at risk. You'd be able to start to understand how that compares to the returns on that species. You'd be able to then start to understand how can you invest in it? How can you affect companies that are lending and trying to actually get credit against it? This allows you, for example, as a bank, to be able to say, if I have a vested interest in the survival of a species, and that the positive survival of that species will actually generate me a return, I'm not going to give favorable rates to an unsustainable company. In that way, you actually have the ability as a financial institution or any sort of investor to start to change the perspectives of the companies. Because if you can make a return of their good performance relative to biodiversity, then you're going to put more pressure on them. If you're going to expose yourself and lose returns, you can put pressure on them to improve their behaviors. So just like a simple thing, imagine if we were to say a tiger is not an animal. a tiger is actually a multinational corporation. You would be able to understand how that tiger is generating your returns, and effectively the extinction of that tiger would be like liquidation of a company. But then you can ask, well, what is there to invest in? Going back to school days, you always had the popular crowd, you had the jocks, you had the nerds, you have all these different groups. Immediately you'd think the popular crowd are the crowd you want to be with, but they are not always the ones that are going to create all the value. You've also got unpopular species, you've got the non-charismatic species. They too create value. They create value, it might be from an economic perspective, it might be from a social perspective, it might be from an environmental perspective, but they too have value. So we can actually value and invest in any species. So for this focus, we've decided to actually turn our attention away from the charismatic and the popular, more to the unloved, misaligned, misunderstood species. So starting with the little ones, spiders. Now, between 3 and 15% of people in this world suffer from arachnophobia. This is made worse by situations such as the Halloween connotation or the horror movies. There are plenty of horror spider movies out there. And people have this perception that spiders are scary, spiders. But spiders have their benefits. This particular tarantula is one of the main predators of a scorpion that is poisonous to people and can kill people. So having that spider there, you're protecting humanity from the scorpions in a natural way. We then have the snakes. Now, 2 to 3% of people have, and I apologize for the pronunciation of this, ophidiophobia. And another 53% actually suffer from severe snake anxiety. Now, the question again is, why do we have this issue? And you start thinking snakes, we've got to get rid of snakes because of this preconceived idea we have of them, which have been brought on by fear factors, by movies. Usually when you have a tense scene, you end up in a pit of snakes. We've got images, books. All of these make us believe that the snakes have no value. But snakes have the venom. That venom is used for antivenoms. So they too do actually have a value. Plus, there's a whole side of the pest control and a natural way of controlling pests. Moving up on the price list, we have the vultures. Now, unfortunately, there's no specific phobia for vultures, but vultures too have been victimized by popular culture. Whether this is through the movies, whether it's through just the belief or misbelief that vultures have a way of killing off livestock and even killing off humans. But vultures are critical to the ecosystem. Remove the vultures and you're going to have a higher incidence of diseases. And those diseases might not be controllable. So the vultures themselves play a critical role to human survival and the ecosystem survival. Moving on to the next level, 51% of Americans have galleophobia, and another 38% effectively will not go to swim in the ocean due to their fear of sharks. This certainly has been raised, this fear, with films such as Jaws. But again, sharks play a crucial role as an ecosystem manager. They play a crucial role when it comes to carbon sequestration. So we cannot ignore the fact that sharks are extremely valuable to us, and they're extremely valuable to the ecosystems. And then we have, on the top end of our scale, the grey wolves. Now, lupophobia has been brought around very much from fairy tales, Brother Grimm, Big Bad Wolf. This is a primal fear, which causes a lot of conflict with wolves, same way as our habitat encroachment makes it even worse, this conflict even worse. But again, the wolves carry significant value, and we've seen the importance of the wolves when it came to the re-establishment of the Yellowstone National Park ecosystems. So Let's think about this from the perspective of finance. Now, essentially, fund managers need to be able to diversify their portfolios. They need to be able to balance their risks returns. And at the end of the day, ultimately, a fund manager is going to be evaluated annually according to their performance and according to their investment decisions. So how do we start to take this into account? How do we start to take into account an ROI or a year-on-year growth? Now, those values that were being shown on the previous slides, those are particular values at a set date in time in a particular year. For the wolf in particular, we did a valuation in 2021 and we did the revaluation in 2022. So we can say that the year-on-year growth in the value of those wolves, which we can justify credibly, is close to 40%. That would suggest that the wolf has significantly outperformed your global index, which has made a loss year on year, a 10-year government bond, which is barely a few percent, and even within the carbon markets. So biodiversity can act as a real return-generating asset. We have to be able to change that mindset away from thinking of biodiversity as this intangible item that sits on a pedestal to actually understanding that biodiversity can work for us. It can work for us in an ethical way, and it can work for us to generate ethical returns. So I'm just going to take a moment to ask a question to the audience and say, would you actually invest in a financial asset that is priced against the actual underlying value of the underlying species? And I'll give you about a minute to respond. Okay, let's see. Results come in. Well, that's encouraging to see. Majority would invest in a specific biodiversity investment that could be based on the real value of the underlying assets. And I think that is actually a very, very powerful statement to see that over 50% of people would be interested. So essentially what we are talking about is a sustainable investment, something that is actually truly sustainable. We are looking at an investment, when you're looking at biodiversity, that supports sustainable ecosystems and healthy ecosystems and the sort of ecosystems that we require in order to survive and in order to combat climate change. We are looking at the support of prosperous economies. Biodiversity contributes to economic growth. It contributes to anything from tourism and tourism-related activities through to insurance services, through to employment, through to food and beverages. So to have a prosperous economy, you need to have a stable underlying ecosystem and stable underlying biodiversity. You also need to have biodiversity for, as I say, climate resilience. So investing in biodiversity, you are investing in climate resilience and your climate products. And ultimately, all of this comes together that by having an investment into biodiversity, you are investing in a healthy planet. You're investing in the future of the human survival and our future generations. So this is a way that we are able to actually have a tangible, impactful, and a real institutional asset class that can make a difference. And this is something that can be ethical, and it does not necessarily, I would say, cross normal desks, but biodiversity can create profit-driven returns. It's about how we structure these assets, and this is what we, as say, at EW are working on, how to structure the product that allows you to invest into biodiversity and actually understand the true value that underpins that investment. So I would like to thank everyone and invite everyone to reach out or to ask questions. You are welcome to scan the QR code and link to me and set up a call if you'd like to discuss any of this in greater detail. And for now, I would say I welcome Stephanie to take over and shock us with some sharks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Shana, I'm wondering if there's a lot of questions about the same issue, which I think maybe would be better if you cover it quickly, which is how you have come up with these values and why they have increased for some species, potentially because they decreased in numbers. I think if you could cover that for a minute, that would take care of a lot of the questions that relate more specifically to what you just said.
So the way we do these valuations, essentially we look at a combination of factors. We look at a mixture of carbon, because ultimately carbon is a valuable contribution for many species. The problem with carbon is it's not something that can immediately be applied to all species, as is the case with the sharks. We know that there are starting to be studies on the carbon, but we cannot yet apply that value to the sharks. But it's something that can add significant upside potential. We look at aesthetic value, which is your traditional type of valuation. We look at up to 28 economic values or economic industries that could be generating value through the specific species of biodiversity, one of which is actually the opportunity cost, where we actually remove that species out of the population to see what is the economic impact of that. We also look at financial hedge value, where we simulate a minimum viable population size and a carrying capacity size to essentially see what would we be willing to pay to maintain that healthy population. That is the value essentially being represented for economy and society. And then for the environment, we actually look at what is the species' role within its own ecosystem, modeling it out for 30 years. If you were to invest in or to manage or support that population, what would it look like, taking into account the rest of its ecosystem and taking into account other exogenous factors. So that is how we come to this financial diversity. So it's essentially how does that species contribute to the economy, to society, to the environment, and how does it generate value for each of them. How that generates greater value is not really on a decreasing population. We look more at the idea of the increasing total value of a population. So when it came to a situation of the wolves, part of this came from the fact that there has been a recovery in terms of the number of people who are going to Yellowstone National Park, and the wolves are a popular attraction there. So implicitly, they are driving more tourists to Yellowstone, so they are helping to drive more economic growth. So those are the sort of ways that the value of the species can go up. And yeah, I would suggest, because I don't want to go too much into detail on that topic, I'm happy if you reach out if you want to discuss it further with me. And then I'll pass it back to you, Stephanie.
Great, thank you. You know, a lot of this is still completely new language to me, and I have to pay very close attention to this. So now I get to talk about something I do know a little bit about. My name is Stephanie Brendel. I am an advocate. I'm glad that Shana introduced me as an advocate, not as an expert. I run a small nonprofit called Shark Allies, dedicated to the protection of sharks. And my role is really more, I would call myself a generalist, not an expert. I live in this space between legislators, researchers, movie makers, everything that influences public opinion, and I try to pull together the tools that help us potentially protect sharks. And that means I get to talk to people that, like Shauna, that are in a completely different field, where you have to learn a completely different language and a different viewpoint. And the wonderful part about this is that every year, as the campaigns change, I get to learn so much more from different viewpoints, that how I think about sharks and conservation now is completely different from 10 years ago, because I learned so much from people. It's always a revolution to listen to legislators and then to listen to a researcher and then come back and listen to someone that is in the financial world. I think there is the big question after all of this is going to be, how are investors supposed to be investing in animals? Maybe what we're talking about is only interesting to conservation people. And this is really the question that I have, is this is why I reached out to Shauna, is can we make that connection that we see the value of animals, but how do we make the investment world see that it is important to also reinvest into an animal that makes so much money? Which brings me to sharks, because I'm not sure of this, but I am potentially, I can see that sharks are probably one of the most money-making animals due to the media and entertainment industry on the planet. Maybe dogs might be close. I'm really not sure. It's something that I'd like to actually look into. But sharks are one of those animals that, you know, they are popular and they are unpopular. They are charismatic, but they're also misunderstood. All of the things that Shauna mentioned, actually sharks have all of that to them. And maybe that is the reason why they are making so much money. Let me get to the next. My slides are going to be very sparse, because I really would like this to be more of a discussion than me just being a talking head to you. Determining the value of a shark, you know, why are we even doing this? You know, for me, the point of this is I wanted an additional tool to show people that sharks are important. Through work with legislators, I realized that you can talk all you want about the health of the ocean and our understanding of how the food chain works, and even animal cruelty. None of that resonates with most people that create policy. Or they might care, but they know that politically it's not something they can represent. And this is, I think, there's a big disconnect, because in the conservation world, we're always looking at the ecocentric value. We know why the animals are important, and why they're important to everyone, not just the people that dive with sharks or that go to see wolves. These animal biodiversity is important for every living thing on the planet. Whereas the policymakers and you know, often also the management authorities, they are looking at what they call an anthropocentric. That's a word I just learned. They are looking at what value does it have to humanity directly? Who is making money? In the case of sharks, the overriding argument is always, how are we going to keep fishermen from losing money from not fishing sharks or not selling fins? And it always is being justified that, oh, we have to keep fishing. We have to let them sell fins because, you know, they're not going to make money off of sharks if they can't sell fins. Never mind the fact that driving the fin trade and supporting the fin trade is leading to the extinction of so many shark species. So the goal was really to have a new tool, and I thought about this for years, and until I met Shauna and Endangered Wildlife, I didn't know that this was possible. And this is only the beginning of it, and I think we will learn a lot about it and improve it over the years. So I'm sure that some of our reports will be a little bit, there's a lot of guesswork involved, because of course you can't count sharks like you can count animals on land. So I think we just have to keep developing this tool over the next years. What we have found through these valuations is that we went out and we focused on the shark populations that are very obviously making a lot of money through tourism, and also that are, featured in most of the movies. It's a little unfair because we're always talking about the large charismatic sharks, and there are little mysterious sharks at the bottom of the ocean that are just as important and that are also endangered. But to start with, we took the animals that also have the most data, that have been tagged, that have been followed, where we can guess the population numbers. When you start thinking about, a mysterious shark like the Greenland shark, not many of them have been tagged. There's not a lot of numbers available. So this is why we went with these animals. These are massive income generating animals because of ecotourism and because of the entertainment industry. So you can see that these numbers are incredible. This is over the next 30 years, where the Guadalupe great white sharks, we estimated that the main portion of the population that comes to the cages and that are viewed and photographed and filmed are worth about 123 million. I apologize, the slides aligned differently, so it's a little confusing because of the software. And that comes out to be 1.89 million per shark. And when you think about what one shark, what somebody can make off of a shark when you kill it one time for a handful of people versus what this animal can make over the next 30 years when you keep it alive, it's obvious that they can contribute to the economy much more if we keep them alive, particularly because they're also not really a food source. They're not really contributing. If you're killing a shark, you're not contributing to food security. You're actually taking away from food security, because a lot of coastal communities that depend on shark fishing potentially for their only protein intake, they're losing out on the sharks that the commercial fishers are taking out in order to fulfill, for example, the fin trade. And of course, the food security is also connected to the fact that sharks are playing such a critical role in keeping food fish populations healthy and vibrant, and keeping the competition in the ocean really vibrant, so that everything keeps pumping and developing and evolving in a healthy way. The other numbers are equally impressive. Bahamas great white sharks, 29.4 million. The tiger sharks, 33.1 million. This is, again, it's over 30 years, which is something that the financial world uses in order to determine one generation. And then the South Africa white sharks, 241.7 million. And that's, that's 500,000 per shark. These numbers would dramatically change once we can establish a carbon value for sharks, and that's underway. So people are looking into that, how much sharks actually contribute to a carbon value. The biggest number that we'd never really calculated before is the entertainment industry. And this is not looking forward, this is looking back, meaning in the last 30 years, how much money has been made on shark movies, Shark Week, etc. And it's close to $3 billion. That does not even include some shows that we haven't been able to get income numbers for example, the National Geographic Shark Fest, we weren't able to get numbers for, and that has been going on for, I think, 10 years or so. And of course, Shark Week is a big contributor. Sharknado, there are franchises that have just been raking in money on the backs of sharks, and on top of making money, have also created. Some of them have fueled the interest in sharks, whether it is for the reason of fear and hate or fascination. So we're always going back and forth between fear and hate and fascination. There's very little in between. Most people have an emotional reaction to sharks, and it's one of those two. We have started to work on Florida, which is very, very incredible and very revealing. The the reason we haven't done the last two species, but the first three species are showing huge numbers. The reason why these sharks are worth so much is because we added the value of recreational fishing, catch and release. Of course, recreational fishing is only sustainable if they are letting the animals go and then they can catch them over and over. Personally, I'm not thrilled with sharks being caught over and over and seeing all of the sharks swimming around with hooks in their mouths. But we have to be realistic. And in a state like Florida, recreational fishing is not going to go away anytime soon. So these animals are worth a huge amount of money and supporting an equally huge number of jobs. And that can be there for many years to come because, of course, sharks live 30, 40 years and they can make money over and over and over again for all those years. Maybe not while they were very little because people usually don't see them then, but once they grow up and they're a little braver and you can go see them and they can be fished, they make a lot of money. Now, what is our desired outcome for this is we need powerful data and better arguments. The data is always important because you try to make a point, you have to back it up with data. And whether we have the best data right now or not, remains to be seen. I'm sure we have to adjust these reports over the next years. But thanks to having local experts, and I want to really thank the people that are showing up today and that have helped us in all of these areas to give us their research and to give us their numbers. We make sure that we include researchers that work on sharks in each of these areas because they contribute on top of data and research, they also contribute their observations and what they know. And that's incredibly important, but we also had to express that in some way, and these reports are that tool. The overall outcome is that we want to change how we talk about the management of sharks. Again, right now, the overriding factor is always how much can we fish them and how much do we lose if we don't fish them. And I think we need to change how we look at the value of sharks. That's the core of this. And we also have to bring in these additional stakeholders in many ways. When we talk to fisheries management authorities, they always, again, they look at recreational and commercial fishing more than they look at diving. And they certainly don't look at the value of sharks in art and entertainment and commerce and recreation. And thus, when we have more stakeholders being considered, that can shift how we look at, again, the value of sharks and how much to protect them. And also, it would be great to work on getting these stakeholders to the table to finance more conservation, to also be part of the conversation and the advocacy for sharks, and to basically broaden how we approach conservation. We can learn so much from people that work in different worlds. The conservation world can be very isolated. So learning from investors, from marketers, from even from filmmakers, from all of these industries can only help us. But we also have to bring them in and say, just making movies or just swimming with sharks is not enough. You actually have to, if you proclaim that you are interested in the animal, you actually have to help protect them. That's a very, very difficult step to take, even within advocacy and social media influencers. So there's some big steps we have to take. And really the outcome should be that protecting sharks is the smart thing to do, even for policymakers. It is a renewable resource, and it not only is important for the health of our planet and food security, but the economy can really benefit from having healthy shark populations. And basically that's it. Sharks as a whole are really valued much more than the price of their fins, the price of their teeth, their skin, and their fins. And that's the main point that we want to get across. So now I think, I don't know if there's going to be questions about shark attacks and the orcas in South Africa. I was told that there were a lot of questions that came in ahead of time on that. I'm going to cover that super quick because it's really the same answer to both. When it comes to questions on why do animals attack, why are shark attacks happening, why are the orcas now hunting sharks, I think the answer is all the same. I think we always want to have everything in a simplified version, but there is no simple answer to this. The fact is that the ocean is a super complex system, and the animals respond to their environment by adjusting and adapting. And the truth of the matter is that we have done tremendous damage to the ocean. We have fished out the prey animals that some of these animals would be looking for. We have changed the fish populations, and we have changed the dynamics. We have even changed the temperature of the ocean, and the temperature of the ocean is shifting how food fish moves. Even just 1 degree of temperature change means that the oxygen content in the ocean changes, and therefore fish that have to make a living trying to get oxygen out of the water will move because it's easier to get oxygen out of colder water. Everything shifts. Why are orcas suddenly showing up somewhere where they weren't before? I can guarantee you that it is because of what humans created. And why are the sharks, the great white sharks, moving? Well, same reason. We have probably fished out their food. And the orcas are smart animals. They may have realized that going after great whites is an easier thing to do than to chase something that's not very abundant anymore. And that's a natural process. And last but not least, I think since, I'm not sure for over how many years, but up till now, something like 1,000, more than 1,000 great whites have been caught in shark nets, whereas the orcas have only taken 9. If great whites were abundant, then what the orcas are taking wouldn't even make a dent. But the problem now is that we're fearing that we're losing great whites. So any single animal being taken is now a big deal. So again, everything comes back to how humans have impacted the ocean. And it's a complex issue that we can't simplify. And there is no one answer to say sharks are bad, orcas are bad, they're doing this, they're learning, they're tracking down humans. It's not that simple. It's complex. And with that, I finish. And then let's get to the Q&A.
Yeah, no, thank you, Stephanie. And I was just going through some of the questions. So there are a couple of questions that are somewhat linked to each other, which I'll try to deal with in one. So essentially, I know there's a question, is there more behind these numbers and more detailed reports? Yes, there are. Our reports for Stephanie are on average between, I think it's 20 to 25 pages, going into detail about how the valuations work. We do this on a consulting basis because I know there is also one of the questions is whether we provide these services. Yes, we do. We offer this on a consulting basis. Whether somebody is interested in an individual species valuation, we can do it on an individual level. We can also do it on a biodiversity richness basis. So where there's for example, a company would like to actually understand what their impact is on biodiversity in general, we are able to actually value a property, a land, an area of actually taking into account the richness as a whole. In terms of, I don't know, Stephanie, if you want me to deal with the idea of the carbon value and
Sure.
the sum of the parts. So effectively, it depends from shark to shark in terms of, is this value worth more than the sum of its parts? I think it was the great white, it was about the parts value was about 10% of or less than 10% of the total value. In general, we tend to find it's less than, I think it was about 5 or 10% if you were to actually sell it for its parts. So there's significant upside to actually making sure that the species survive. In terms of the carbon, We know there are scientific studies that are going on in terms of being able to assess the carbon value. I think it's still a bit early stage to say whether or not they would be approved by Vera or Gold Standard, but it would be scientifically justified metrics behind the calculation of the carbon. And likewise, in terms of doing things with regards to insects and bacteria and the soil, this is something we are working on to do a pilot of that. We have already done some of the insects. We've done, for example, the bees, and we are looking at the option of things like butterflies. So we do believe that this sort of method is suitable for all types of species, and is not only the tourism side of it. Tourism is one of those factors. When you talk about something like a mangroves, it's not heavily tourism, and in fact it's not only carbon either. There's the insurance side that comes into play. When you're talking about the seagrass, there's an insurance side that comes in. Plus it's important as a nursery for other species, and it helps to support the fishing communities. When we talk about something like the spiders, you're not going to get a huge amount of tourism value on spiders. So yes, tourism is one of those factors that we do consider, but it is not the only factor that comes into play when we're looking at the value of these species. So on that, Stephanie, is there a question that you want to answer?
Well, I think that a lot of these questions are, what are the specifics, and also how, this question about whether tourism can be the driver. I think that the answer is that every species and even every location is different, even for sharks. You cannot say that a shark in a place where nobody dives has the same value. There are no values in ecotourism, but they might be incredibly important for the food fish that are in that area. So I think the ecosystem services of sharks, for example, are very important in a lot of areas. And in some areas, it's recreational fishing. In other areas, it's even culture. In the Pacific Islands, for example, sharks play a very important role in their culture, in their history, and in their stories. So a lot of this is something that it's difficult to put a number on it. So therefore, you cannot compare these valuation reports to something that you can exactly count and that is the same everywhere you go, and also the fact that, there's a question on whether this is accredited or not and whether there are background reports. I think on our website, sharkallies.org, we have a whole section on these reports where we have sort of a simple version, and then there's also a link to the full reports, which are 25, 30, 35 pages of how these reports are composed. So anyone that's interested in that can reach out to Shana and myself. Going through one of these reports and showing that here would take about 3 hours. So this is not what we wanted to get into. And as far as the accreditation or how this is going or how this turns into a financial, aspect that somebody can invest to, that's something that Shana has to talk about, because that's not my world.
So in terms of accreditation, currently we literally are the only people who are doing this sort of valuation. We are ahead of the market in terms of what we do, how we approach it. Now, what we do, though, is justifiable. It is based on very credible, very standardized methods of valuation. From my side, this is not a scientific valuation, it's a financial valuation. With my background coming out of the investment banking as a sell-side institutional equity analyst for about 15 years, we do the valuations based on best known public information, which can stand up, be scrutinized, and can be defended. The same way as anyone would go out and do a valuation of a company, no two valuations are going to be identical because different people have different assumptions, have access to different information. but it is something that it can be justified, it can be supported, it can be motivated as to why this is based on a best estimate. So in that way, yes, it is something that can stand on, these values can stand on their own 2 feet or 2 fins. But essentially, it is something that can be justified. And why people should care about this? Well, okay, from investors, yes, you want to maximize your returns. Now, part of the idea of maximizing returns is also you want to be able to be assessed yourself. You get your 13th check, you want to prove that you can perform well. Your 13th check is based on your performance against the market. Now, if you are to consider the greater picture, where people are starting to become more and more sensitive to these green investments, there's a lot of greenwashing going on. That's something that's quite. I'm not going to go down the story of the greenwashing, but essentially, if you understand that your company is going to have a higher exposure to biodiversity, you're able to make a decision. Because effectively, if you have a shipping company, their vessel has a large oil leak, kills out all of the remaining sharks in an area, you're able to then start to understand what is the value at risk that you're covering or carrying by having a company in your portfolio. That means that essentially, if you want to diversify yourself, how do you do it? You want to invest in a species to cover the potential loss of another species, or you want to be able to say to the shipping company, listen, we know your vessels are outdated. You exposing us to added risk. That can affect my performance. Do something about it. In which case, you're able to adjust it. So in that way, you're able to influence. Now, the other reason why you'd have an interest and why there should be interest from investors is effectively, if you're able to understand what this value performance is, you can effectively say, why do people invest in cattle? Okay, cattle provide food. Biodiversity provides other services. It is a tangible asset, or it can be an intangible asset, depending whether you're talking flora or fauna, but either way, it becomes an asset to your business. If that value goes up, your balance sheet value goes up. Same way as if your livestock value goes up, your balance sheet value goes up. So biodiversity is an alternative form of biological assets. So an investor would be able to generate returns. They would be able to profit off the biodiversity if used in a proper and effective way. And this is where there needs to be that change in mindset, that biodiversity is not just something sitting over there that you look out the window and you see a bird. That bird is doing a function for you. That bird is generating returns for you. And that is why an investor should be paying attention to the idea of how do I make, or how do I generate a return off this? Or as say, how do I reduce my risk exposure? It's the idea of risk versus return. How do I penalize a bad company, and how do I promote good operations? So this is, we function around the idea of money. We function around the idea of valuing. We value people every day. We are a species. If you're going to value one species and create a world that centers around value for one species, we have to acknowledge the value of other species, because the other species are they are integral to our survival. So yeah, there's all these multiple ways of why investors should be concerned about it. Investors also should be concerned about the fact that there are changing regulations. They have to start to report, am I having a positive, negative impact on biodiversity? Working with just simple metrics is not going to actually do anything. You've got to re-educate yourself. You've got to be able to explain, what does this mean? What's the difference of a 0.01 in an index? Money people understand. Money is the language of finance. So that is why these sort of being able to understand value and actually be able to trade on that value and invest in that value can become a very, very powerful tool for the survival of biodiversity. And I hope that all answers the sort of questions that, with regards to why people should be looking at biodiversity and why people should be investing in biodiversity. So I'm going through more questions to see if there are any other questions. In terms of the policies and countries leading in this, I do believe I've had some conversations. There are countries that are changing the way they are seeing things. I would prefer not to really go too deeply into that, because it's conversations that I've had that might not necessarily be public information. But yes, there are countries that are looking at how to implement better strategies on biodiversity.
I can add something to this.
Yeah.
There's this question I find really good. If this is really, a question, the second part is companies and investor, why should companies and investor care? Besides the ethical solidarity argument, and, he says, as we all know, most companies follow a profit maximization approach. So is this valuation framework only targeted towards policymakers? That's a really big question. For me, initially, I am very happy if this tool helps me change policymakers, to be honest. It has already helped in certain places where we worked on shark fin legislation. The argument, it was not supported until we brought in the value of sharks in, for example, ecotourism. And again, income numbers and the future of economies and renewable income that is basically evergreen, that interests policymakers no matter where they are on the spectrum politically. So for me, even if this only helps for policy making, this will be a huge, huge help. Now, how this actually can turn into a tool where investors will invest directly, that remains to be seen, whether ethics and the health of the planet and things that ensure keeping systems alive, whether people recognize the value of that and can get beyond just looking at exactly what returns they're getting in terms of dollars. I think there's a big leap that has to be made. And again, it's another complex answer, because people only see what the immediate return is, and they do not think about what may happen in 10 or 20 years. And already we've seen when certain species are extinct or threatened or greatly reduced, there's a huge cost to society and even a huge cost to certain industries, because that animal, most animals have a very specific role. And when that role, when you take that animal away, by the way, they're doing this for free. All we have to do is not kill them. These animals, let's go back to sharks, they have what they do in the ocean, cleaning up and keeping disease at bay, et cetera, taking out, keeping the pressure on fish populations. They're doing this for free if we just don't reduce them to a point where they can't do their job. We cannot replace that role. We've seen that with wolves in Yellowstone. What wolves have done to Yellowstone to change the whole system and in essence, increase tourism and increase everything. Nobody could replace that. No hunters that wanted to regulate the deer, they could not replace that. So, we have to get out of our heads and always only think of the immediate moment. What is happening? I don't want that animal there because it might be attacking someone, and that's not good for my beach, and they're invading my area. But really, we have to start thinking a little bit differently. I know that is not an answer to the investment question, but again, I think it's very new to think about biodiversity in terms of finances, and I think it will require a lot of people coming to this and figuring out how that can happen.
I'm just going to answer one more question. And basically, I think any questions that have not been answered, we will aim to reply via email to make sure that everyone gets their answers. The question with regards to any intention of creating an international exchange of natural capital where shares can be really bought and sold, that is essentially what we're aiming for, through the financial instrument that we are developing, to effectively be able to have an exchange that would allow people to literally buy and sell a vested interest in a species directly based on the actual underlying value of the species, and not just a hypothetical guess of a species value relative to other markets. So that is something that we plan to work with, and that is something that anyone who wishes to partner with that sort of project, please let me know, because that is something that for me is the ultimate goal. It's something that I've been working on since 2005, created that instrument in 2005, and that is essentially, to me, the greatest solution or the greatest possibility for biodiversity and the survival of biodiversity. So yes, that is the plan. And plan is to keep you updated as things progress. But I would like to now just say thank you very much to Stephanie for joining me. And thank you to everyone who attended today. And as say, you're welcome to reach out to either of us if you have any other questions or would like to find out more information. And as we will try to respond to all the questions that we were unfortunately unable to deal with this afternoon. So thank you very much, and wishing everyone a great day, or great evening, or great morning, depending where you are.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shauna.